April 1946. The school stood at the edge of town, its wooden frame warped by heat and age. Several windows were missing entirely, replaced with boards cut unevenly from scrap. Inside, desks were pushed together where glass had fallen months earlier. Chalk dust still clung to the blackboard, untouched since the final air raids. Classes had never formally ended. They had simply stopped. Children waited in the yard without speaking. They had learned to watch before moving. When the soldiers appeared at the far end of the road, no one ran. They recognized the uniforms now. American. The war was over, but its rules still lingered in the body. The men did not enter the building. They set down their packs. One carried planks. Another unrolled wire and tools. A truck idled nearby, its bed filled not with weapons, but with lumber scavenged from a depot. No orders were shouted. No flags raised. The children watched as broken windows were measured, as boards were lifted into place. For the first time in months, the school was being repaired, not claimed. That moment, quiet, unannounced, was not accidental. It was the result of decisions made long before the soldiers reached this town. The war's end and the occupation of Japan. By the spring of 1946, Japan was no longer a battlefield, but it was far from stable. The formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in September 1945 had ended organized resistance, yet the country that remained was physically shattered and psychologically exhausted. Cities lay in ruins. Transportation networks were fractured. Food shortages were widespread. And for millions of civilians, especially children, daily life was defined by absence, of safety, of routine, of certainty. The American occupation of Japan, led by Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers General Douglas MacArthur, was unprecedented in scale and intent. Unlike previous occupations shaped primarily by punishment or extraction, this one was designed around restructuring an entire society. Demilitarization and democratization were its official pillars. But beneath those broad directives lay thousands of smaller, practical challenges that shaped how the occupation was experienced on the ground. Education was one of them. By 1945, Japan's school system had been deeply intertwined with the war effort. Classrooms had reinforced imperial ideology. Children were taught obedience, sacrifice, and loyalty to the state. As the war intensified, many schools were repurposed for civil defense, storage, or evacuation centers. Older students were mobilized for labor. Younger ones were relocated to the countryside. By the time the bombing ended, countless school buildings were damaged or abandoned, and regular instruction had largely collapsed. American occupation planners understood that schools were more than places of learning. They were symbols. Reopening them, physically and ideologically, was essential to stabilizing civilian life. But doing so required caution. The population was traumatized. Years of propaganda had portrayed foreign soldiers as brutal and predatory. Even after surrender, fear remained embedded in behavior, particularly among children who had known nothing but war. Early occupation reports noted this clearly. In towns where American troops appeared suddenly or moved aggressively, children disappeared from streets and courtyards. In areas where soldiers maintained distance and consistency, fear gradually subsided. These observations shaped evolving policy. Authority, commanders realized, could no longer rely on intimidation. The war had already done enough of that. At the same time, American forces faced their own constraints. The occupation was conducted with limited manpower relative to the population it governed. Soldiers were exhausted. Units rotated frequently. Maintaining order through force alone was neither sustainable nor desirable. Stability had to be built through cooperation, routine, and visible restraint. This was especially true in rural towns and smaller cities, where infrastructure damage was uneven but social disruption was severe. In such places, schools often became focal points of recovery. They were among the few remaining communal spaces. Restoring them offered a way to signal continuity without confrontation. Military government officers worked alongside Japanese administrators to assess damage and prioritize repairs. In many cases, resources were scarce. Lumber, glass, and tools were rationed. Decisions had to be made about what could realistically be fixed and what would remain unusable for years. Yet again and again, schools appeared near the top of those lists, not because they were strategically valuable, but because their absence prolonged instability. For children, the closure of schools had removed more than education. It had erased routine. Days blurred together. Authority existed only in the form of orders, warnings, and shortages. Reopening a classroom, even a damaged one, meant restoring a sense of time and expectation. American soldiers assigned to civil affairs units were instructed to support these efforts when possible. Their role was not to teach or to command, but to assist, to carry materials, to repair roofs, to replace windows, to do so visibly, without weapons and without ceremony. These actions were small within the vast machinery of occupation. But they were deliberate. Each one was meant to communicate something precise. The war was over, and its instruments would not define what came next. Yet policy alone did not determine how these moments unfolded. The reality depended on individual decisions by officers, by enlisted men, and by civilians watching from a distance. Those encounters, shaped by fear, expectation, and uncertainty, would soon reveal how deeply the war had marked the youngest generation. Fear, expectation, and the world children inherited. For Japanese children in 1945 and 1946, the end of the war did not arrive as a clear moment. There were no sirens announcing peace, no sudden return to normal life. Instead, the war receded unevenly, leaving behind habits of fear that did not dissolve with surrender. Most children had spent years learning to respond instantly to authority. School drills had trained them to bow, to stand in silence, to endure discomfort without complaint. Air raid education had taught them to associate sound with danger and adults with command. Even play had been regulated, reshaped to reflect discipline and preparedness. Childhood, as it had existed before the war, had been compressed into obedience. The collapse of the state's wartime institutions did not immediately free them from those patterns. Parents were preoccupied with survival. Food scarcity dominated household life. Many fathers were dead, missing, or returning wounded and withdrawn. Mothers navigated black markets and ration lines. Emotional reassurance was limited not by indifference, but by exhaustion. In this environment, schools represented something rare: structure without scarcity. A place where children might be told what to do, and where that instruction might not involve danger. But schools were also sites of anxiety. Years of indoctrination had framed foreign soldiers as existential threats. American forces, in particular, were described as cruel, undisciplined, and racially alien. Even after surrender, these images persisted. Children expected violence not because it was happening, but because it had always been promised. Occupation authorities were aware of this tension. Intelligence summaries compiled in late 1945 and early 1946 emphasized the psychological dimension of governance. The population was compliant, but compliance driven by fear was unstable. Especially among children, visible terror risked long-term consequences: withdrawal, aggression, or deep mistrust of any authority. As a result, American policy increasingly distinguished between control and presence. Control could be maintained through law and regulation. Presence, however, had to be reshaped. In civilian spaces, markets, clinics, and especially schools, soldiers were expected to appear restrained, predictable, and non-threatening. This did not emerge overnight. Early occupation months were uneven. In some areas, armed patrols entered school grounds to inspect buildings or requisition space. Children hid. Teachers froze. These encounters were recorded as counterproductive. Reports circulated noting that armed presence in educational settings triggered panic responses disproportionate to any actual threat. Gradually, procedures changed. Civil affairs officers coordinated with Japanese educators to schedule repairs during daylight hours. Soldiers were instructed to leave rifles behind when entering school properties unless security conditions required otherwise. Interactions were to be brief, purposeful, and calm. Translators were used sparingly. Gestures replaced commands whenever possible. These adjustments were not sentimental. They were tactical responses to observed behavior. Fear slowed cooperation. Calm accelerated it. For children, the difference was profound. The first time American soldiers arrived without weapons, the reaction was confusion rather than relief. Children watched hands closely. They waited for raised voices or sudden movement. When none came, silence filled the space. That silence was unfamiliar and unsettling. War had conditioned them to expect escalation. Its absence felt temporary. Yet the soldiers returned. Again without rifles. Again without orders shouted across courtyards. They carried tools instead of arms. Wood planks instead of ammunition. Buckets, hammers, panes of salvaged glass. Teachers later recalled how children clustered near windows or door frames, observing in rigid stillness. No one laughed. No one spoke. But no one ran. That stillness marked the beginning of recalibration. Each repeated visit eroded expectation. Authority was still present, but it did not behave as expected. The uniform no longer guaranteed danger. Over time, curiosity replaced vigilance. Children leaned forward. They whispered questions to one another. Some stepped closer, measuring distance with caution learned over years of survival. For the American soldiers involved, these moments were rarely described as emotional. Official reports noted improved cooperation, reduced disruption, and smoother reopening schedules. Yet beneath that administrative language lay something more fragile and more significant. A generation that had learned to fear movement, sound, and command was encountering authority that paused instead of advanced. That shift did not end trauma. It did not undo loss. But it created the conditions in which something else could emerge. And it set the stage for the quiet moments that followed, moments when repair became more than reconstruction, and presence became something children had never been taught to expect. Angle 1. The child's perspective, fear relearned as observation. For Japanese children, the arrival of American soldiers at their schools disrupted a lifetime of conditioning. They had been trained not to interpret intent, but to obey signals. Uniforms meant authority. Authority meant danger. Safety depended on immediate compliance. When soldiers arrived to repair schools rather than occupy them, the children did not initially understand what they were seeing. Their responses were not emotional in a conventional sense. They were procedural. They stood when told to stand. They waited when told to wait. But when instructions did not come, uncertainty filled the gap. This uncertainty was heavy. Children watched posture more than words. They tracked where soldiers placed their tools, how they moved through doorways, whether they blocked exits. These were survival calculations learned during bombing raids and evacuations. Gradually, patterns emerged. Soldiers worked. They did not shout. They did not seize space. They repaired floors, windows, and desks damaged by neglect or blast shock. When a task was finished, they left. For children, repetition mattered more than reassurance. Each return without violence weakened expectation. Each completed repair without command altered perception. Tears, when they appeared, were not expressions of joy. They were releases, responses to the collapse of a belief that had governed daily life. Angle 2. The tactical logic, stability over spectacle. From a military perspective, school repair was not charity. It was stabilization. Education infrastructure supported order, reduced displacement, and allowed parents to re-enter labor. Schools kept children contained, supervised, and fed through emerging lunch programs. Armed presence in these spaces was unnecessary and often counterproductive. Tactical assessments recognized that visible weapons in non-combat zones increased anxiety and slowed cooperation. By contrast, unarmed engagement reduced resistance without diminishing authority. Civil affairs units documented faster reopening timelines where soldiers entered schools without rifles. Repairs proceeded without interruption. Teachers collaborated instead of withdrawing. Children remained present rather than dispersing. The decision to fix schools rather than requisition them also reflected resource logic. Damaged buildings could not serve occupation needs. Restored schools, however, served civilian stability and indirectly reduced the burden on military governance. Angle 3. Psychological fracture, ideology confronts behavior. Japanese wartime education had emphasized moral absolutes. Enemies were defined through caricature. Violent, chaotic, inferior. These images were reinforced through textbooks, youth organizations, and radio. Unarmed soldiers repairing classrooms did not fit that framework. Children struggled to reconcile what they had been taught with what they observed. The contradiction did not provoke debate. Provoked silence. Questions were internal. Why would an enemy fix a school? Why would a conqueror leave desks instead of taking space? This fracture did not erase indoctrination, but it weakened its certainty. And certainty was the foundation on which fear rested. Once fear lost coherence, emotion followed, not as celebration, but as release. Tears came quietly, often after soldiers left, often without explanation. These angles, human response, tactical calculation, and ideological disruption, did not operate separately. They reinforced one another, shaping encounters that were small in scale but cumulative in effect. And together they pointed toward a deeper shift, one rooted not in repair, but in responsibility. Moral authority, cultural collision, and the soldier's burden. Angle 4, moral authority, power without seizure. In post-surrender Japan, authority was absolute. The occupation left no ambiguity about who controlled space, movement, and resources. Yet within that certainty, American civil affairs officers faced a choice: enforce authority through dominance, or express it through restraint. Repairing schools without occupying them became one of the clearest expressions of that restraint. From a moral standpoint, this was not leniency. It was control exercised without humiliation. Schools were symbolic spaces, repositories of national identity, discipline, and future continuity. To seize them would have been efficient. To restore them was deliberate. For children, the message was unmistakable. Authority could act without erasing what existed before. Power did not always arrive to take. This reframed the meaning of defeat. Loss was no longer synonymous with annihilation. The structure of daily life, classrooms, routines, familiar objects remained intact. That continuity softened the psychological rupture of surrender. Moral authority, in this context, was not declared. It was demonstrated, quietly, repeatedly. Angle 5, cultural collision, silence as a shared language. Language barriers limited verbal interaction. Many American soldiers spoke no Japanese. Many Japanese teachers spoke no English. Yet schools became sites of sustained contact. Silence filled the gap. Soldiers communicated through gesture. Teachers responded through posture. Children observed both. This absence of speech reduced the risk of misinterpretation. No slogans were translated. No ideology was imposed verbally. Instead, meaning emerged through behavior. A soldier repairing a window without being asked. A teacher stepping aside without protest. A child watching from a doorway rather than fleeing. These exchanges formed a shared grammar of intent. In a society conditioned to equate authority with command, the absence of shouted orders was destabilizing. But it was also clarifying. Actions became the only text. This silent negotiation allowed coexistence without immediate reconciliation. Neither side needed to agree. They only needed to observe. Angle 6. The soldier's burden, carrying the end of war. For many American soldiers, repairing schools came after years of combat that had defined survival through aggression. The shift was not seamless. Some struggled with the contradiction. The same uniform that had advanced under fire now knelt on classroom floors. The same hands that had fired weapons now lifted desks. This was not redemption. It was transition. Military correspondence from the period reflects unease among troops assigned to civilian duties. Combat had provided clarity. Occupation required judgment. The absence of an enemy did not remove responsibility, it multiplied it. For soldiers with children at home, the experience carried additional weight. Schools became mirrors. Damage became personal. Repair was no longer abstract. This internal adjustment mattered. Children sensed it. The absence of threat was not only physical. It was emotional. Soldiers who moved carefully, who avoided loud commands, who respected boundaries, communicated restraint without explanation. These final angles reveal the deeper mechanism at work. Repairing schools was not a single act. It was a convergence of moral authority, cultural adaptation, and personal reckoning. Together, they prepared the ground for the moment when repair transformed into recognition. And that recognition would define the turning point. Yes. 4. Climax/turning point Section 1. When repair became irreversible. By the late summer of 1945, the transformation was no longer tentative. The war had ended on paper weeks earlier. Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd had closed the conflict diplomatically. But on the ground, the meaning of that surrender was still taking shape, quietly, unevenly, town by town. In many Japanese cities, schools reopened before factories, before government offices, before transportation fully stabilized. This was not accidental. Occupation planners understood that schools were among the few institutions capable of restoring routine quickly. Children needed structure. Parents needed somewhere safe to send them. Communities needed a signal that daily life could resume without fear. The decisive shift occurred when American involvement moved from emergency repair to sustained presence. Initially, soldiers had fixed what was broken enough to function. Windows were boarded. Roofs were patched. Desks were salvaged. But as weeks passed, repairs became systematic. Lumber was requisitioned. Engineers assessed structural damage. Military trucks delivered supplies not for command posts but for classrooms. This escalation marked a point of no return. Once resources were allocated, once schedules were established, once soldiers returned day after day to the same school buildings, the gesture ceased to be symbolic. It became policy in practice even before it was codified. Children noticed first. They recognized patterns before adults did. The same faces returned. The same routes were walked. Tools appeared, disappeared, and reappeared. Damage lessened. Noise shifted from explosions to hammer strikes, from sirens to voices. The moment of recognition often arrived without ceremony. In multiple post-war interviews, Japanese adults recalled children announcing changes before they themselves accepted them. A child saying the soldiers would come back tomorrow. A child leaving home earlier to watch repairs. A child crying, not from fear, but from confusion at kindness appearing where threat had been expected. These reactions signaled the turning point. The schoolyard became the clearest stage for this shift. Once a site of militarized drills and ideological instruction, it now hosted a different choreography. Soldiers worked at the edges. Teachers reclaimed the center. Children moved between them cautiously at first, then freely. No orders were issued. No flags were raised. But authority had changed form. The occupation no longer needed to prove its power. It was already uncontested. What mattered now was how that power would be experienced. And in classrooms being repaired rather than seized, a new answer was taking hold. This answer would soon be tested by scarcity, by resentment, and by the deeper wounds of war that repair alone could not erase. When repair became irreversible, by the late summer of 1945, the transformation was no longer tentative. The war had ended on paper weeks earlier. Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd had closed the conflict diplomatically. But on the ground, the meaning of that surrender was still taking shape, quietly, unevenly, town by town. In many Japanese cities, schools reopened before factories, before government offices, before transportation fully stabilized. This was not accidental. Occupation planners understood that schools were among the few institutions capable of restoring routine quickly. Children needed structure. Parents needed somewhere safe to send them. Communities needed a signal that daily life could resume without fear. The decisive shift occurred when American involvement moved from emergency repair to sustained presence. Initially, soldiers had fixed what was broken enough to function. Windows were boarded. Roofs were patched. Desks were salvaged. But as weeks passed, repairs became systematic. Lumber was requisitioned. Engineers assessed structural damage. Military trucks delivered supplies not for command posts but for classrooms. This escalation marked a point of no return. Once resources were allocated, once schedules were established, once soldiers returned day after day to the same school buildings, the gesture ceased to be symbolic. It became policy in practice even before it was codified. Children noticed first. They recognized patterns before adults did. The same faces returned. The same routes were walked. Tools appeared, disappeared, and reappeared. Damage lessened. Noise shifted from explosions to hammer strikes, from sirens to voices. The moment of recognition often arrived without ceremony. In multiple post-war interviews, Japanese adults recalled children announcing changes before they themselves accepted them. A child saying the soldiers would come back tomorrow. A child leaving home earlier to watch repairs. A child crying, not from fear, but from confusion at kindness appearing where threat had been expected. These reactions signaled the turning point. The schoolyard became the clearest stage for this shift. Once a site of militarized drills and ideological instruction, it now hosted a different choreography. Soldiers worked at the edges. Teachers reclaimed the center. Children moved between them cautiously at first, then freely. No orders were issued. No flags were raised. But authority had changed form. The occupation no longer needed to prove its power. It was already uncontested. What mattered now was how that power would be experienced. And in classrooms being repaired rather than seized, a new answer was taking hold. This answer would soon be tested by scarcity, by resentment, and by the deeper wounds of war that repair alone could not erase.